Welcome everyone. Today we are going to discuss the story of how a blind revolutionary wrote the greatest epic in the English language to survive the collapse of his world. To understand Paradise Lost, you cannot just look at the Bible. You must also look at the streets of London in the 17th century. We are going to treat this history not as a list of dates, but as a 3-act tragedy involving kings, rebels, and the death of a dream. This narrative contains all the keywords: Puritanism, the Restoration, divine right, and regicide, which you need to weave into your exam answers also to show deep analytical understanding. Imagine the early 17th century. The world is splitting in two. On one side, you have the old world. This is the world of the divine right of kings. In this worldview, the king, in this case James I and later his son Charles I, is not just a politician. He is God's deputy on earth. To question the king is to question God. The king stands at the top of the social hierarchy, and everyone else must stay in their lane. This is theocentric or God-centered universe, where authority is absolute. On the other side, a new world is waking up. This is driven by two massive forces. One, Renaissance humanism, where scholars are realizing that man is the center of action, or anthropocentrism. Science is challenging the church. Galileo proves the sun, not the earth, is the center of the universe. And two, the Reformation, or Puritanism. For centuries, the Bible was locked in Latin. Now it is translated into English. Suddenly, the common man, the shopkeeper, the soldier, the poet, can read God's word himself. He begins to think, if I don't need a priest to talk to God, why do I need a king to tell me how to live? The conflict there arises. King Charles I wants absolute power. He loves high art, expensive theatre, called masques, and rituals. He represents the visual, the luxurious, and the autocratic. Against him rise the Puritans. They hate the luxury. They love the text. They believe in austerity, morality, and the rights of the Parliament. Now comes the unthinkable revolution as the second act of this, the Civil War and regicide. The tension snaps in 1642. The English Civil War begins. It is the royalists or cavaliers with their long hair and fine clothes versus the parliamentarians or roundheads with their cropped hair and iron discipline. John Milton is right in the middle of this. He isn't fighting with a sword, he's fighting with a pen. He becomes the Secretary for Foreign Tongues, essentially the propaganda minister for the rebellion. Then, in 1649, the rebels do something that shocks the entire world. They don't just defeat King Charles I, they put him on a trial for treason and chop off his head. This is regicide. Stop and think about the weight of this. For 1,000 years, kings were seen as holy. By killing the king, Milton and his party believed they were clearing the way for the kingdom of God on earth. They established a republic led by Oliver Cromwell. Milton believed this was the dawn of a new age of liberty. He gave his eyesight for this cause, writing pamphlets until he went completely blind in service to the Republic in 1652. Now comes the third act, the Great Clash, or the Restoration of 1660. This is the most critical part of the story of Paradise Lost. The Republic lasted only 11 years. It collapsed into chaos. The English people, tired of the strict, fun-hating rule of the Puritans, decided they wanted a king again. In 1660, the son of the executed king was invited back. This is the Restoration. King Charles II takes the throne. For the royalists, it was a party. Theatres opened, wine flowed, and the merry monarch reigned. But for John Milton, 1660 was the apocalypse. Everything Milton worked for was erased overnight. The Republic was dead. Milton was a wanted man. He was known as a defender of the king killers. He was arrested. His books were burned by the hangman, and he only narrowly escaped execution himself. Imagine believing that God was on your side, that you were building a holy nation, and then watching God seemingly hand victory to the wicked king. Milton is now blind, poor, despised, and living in a country that hates him. It is in this darkness, after 1660, that Milton dictates Paradise Lost. When you read Book 1, you are not just reading about demons. You are reading the psychological landscape of a defeated revolutionary. The poem opens with Satan and his rebel angels lying stunned in a burning lake. They have just fought a war against the ultimate king, God, and lost everything. This mirrors the state of the Puritans in 1660, crushed, confused, and wondering why they failed. In Book 1, the demons build a capital city called Pandemonium. Milton describes it as having a golden roof, vast pillars, and being lit by artificial lamps, or starry lamps and blazing cressets. This architecture looks suspiciously like the Catholic cathedrals and the royal palaces that the Puritans hated. By giving the demons a beautiful, golden, luxurious palace, Milton is saying that external beauty often hides internal evil. He is critiquing the Restoration Court of Charles II, glittering on the outside, but hell on the inside. Satan gives incredible speeches. He says, "What though the field be lost? All is not lost." And he speaks of unconquerable will. Many students ask, is Satan the hero? The answer? Satan sounds like a hero because he sounds like old Milton, the revolutionary fighting against a monarch. But Milton is smart. He shows us that this rebellion, unlike the English one, is based on pride, not liberty. Satan is a tragic parody of the Republican hero. He fights not to be free, but to be king himself. So when you write your answers, tell this story. Paradise Lost is a post-restoration epic. It answers the painful question that haunted Milton. Why did the strong rebellion fail? To understand John Milton, you must first understand that he did not stumble into greatness. He prepared for it with the discipline of a soldier. Born in 1608, Milton's early life was a golden age of intellectual accumulation. His father, a scrivener and composer, ensured that young John had access to the best education money could buy. He attended St. Paul's School and later Cambridge, but his real classroom was his own library. During the first phase of his life, Milton was the ultimate child of the Renaissance. He absorbed everything: Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Italian. He was not just a Puritan, he was a humanist. He carried within himself the legacy of the classical world, of Homer and Virgil, and the immediate brilliance of the Renaissance, of Shakespeare and Spencer. He traveled extensively across Europe, a grand tour that was crucial to his development. He didn't just read about history, he walked through it. He met Galileo in Italy, a meeting between the poet of the cosmos and the scientist of the stars. This encounter would later echo in Paradise Lost, where Milton references the Tuscan artist viewing the moon through his optic glass. In this period, he wrote poems like On the Morning of Christ's Nativity and The Mask, Comus. These were experiments, the flexing of muscles. He was consciously preparing himself to write a masterpiece, believing that a great poet must himself be a true poem, a pattern of the best and most honorable things. Then history interrupted art. The second phase of Milton's life is defined by silence, at least poetic silence. When the English Civil War broke out, Milton made a conscious, radical choice. He put down his poetry pen and picked up the weapon of political rhetoric. He abandoned his grand tour to return home because he felt he could not remain an intellectual tourist while his countrymen were fighting for liberty. He became the voice of the Puritan Revolution and Oliver Cromwell's government. He served as the Secretary of Foreign Tongues, defending the execution of Charles I to the rest of Europe. This was Milton at the height of his worldly power. He was famous, influential, and deeply involved in the machinery of the state. But this fame came at a terrible cost. First, he sacrificed his art. For nearly 2 years, he wrote almost no poetry, pouring his energy into prose pamphlets, propaganda for the Republic. Second, he sacrificed his sight. Doctors warned him that if he continued to write and read at such a feverish pace, he would go blind. Milton, driven by his sense of duty to the good old cause, ignored them. By 1652, he was completely blind. He had given his eyes for the revolution, and then the revolution failed. The third phase begins in 1660 with the Restoration. The return of King Charles II was the ultimate tragedy for Milton. The political cause he had sacrificed his sight and his prime years for had collapsed. The people had chosen a king over a republic. Milton was now a triple outcast. Politically, he was a defeated rebel, hiding from execution. Physically, he was trapped in total darkness. Domestically, he was lonely. His first marriage to Mary Powell, a royalist, had been a disaster, leaving him with a deep sense of isolation that would later influence his depiction of Adam and Eve's marital strife. It is here in the depths of defeat that the miracle happens. Stripped of his political power, his eyesight, and his public standing, Milton turned inward. The distractions of fame were gone. The sunny resort of Shakespearean entertainment was closed to him. He was now living in the dark castle of his own mind. He returned to an idea he had nursed for decades. Originally, he had planned to write a tragedy titled Adam Unparadised. But a play is mimetic. It requires performance, actors, and an objective view of characters. Milton was too personally invested, too full of his own voice and pain to write a play. He needed the epic form, a diegetic medium where the narrator himself could speak directly to the reader. Why Paradise Lost, you may ask? The poem is not just a retelling of Genesis. It is Milton's interrogation of God. Why did the revolution fail? Was my choice to support Cromwell wrong? Why does God allow the wicked or Charles II to triumph over the righteous? In the darkness, Milton dictated the verses of Paradise Lost to his daughters and assistants. He summoned the memories of the landscapes he saw in Italy to paint the Garden of Eden. He used the memory of the Civil War battles to describe the war in heaven. He channeled his own despair and defiance into the speeches of Satan. So when you read Paradise Lost, remember this. You are not reading ink on a page. You are reading the memories of a blind man. Every description of light, every color, every sunrise in the poem is a heartbreaking recollection of a world he could no longer see. Milton teaches us that suffering is not the end of greatness. It is often the prerequisite for it. He justified the ways of God to men not by winning a political war, but by creating a universe of words that no king could ever destroy. This is why Paradise Lost is both the most autobiographical and the most universal text in the English canon. It is the sound of a man standing amidst the ruins of his life and deciding to build a cathedral. Now, when we approach Paradise Lost, we must first acknowledge the sheer audacity of this task. How does a single man take a book as monumental as the Bible and carve a poem out of it? For the sake of literature, we must look at the Bible not just as a religious text, but as a massive, sprawling narrative. A literary masterpiece in its own right, much like the Gita or the Quran. The section Milton chose was the Genesis. The word Genesis itself means origin or beginning. It is the account of how the universe was formed, how man was molded from dust, and how he lost his immortality through a single act of disobedience. But here lies the problem of the storyteller. If Milton were to follow the timeline of the Bible strictly, he would have to begin with God creating the heavens and the earth. But he does not do that. He bypasses the beginning entirely and drops us into a moment when the story is already half over. This technique is what we call in medias res, which in Latin is for the middle of things. To understand why he did this, he must distinguish between a story and a plot. A story is a simple chronological sequence. There was a king, he had a son, the son went hunting, the son got lost. It moves in a straight line of time. A plot, however, is the artistic rearrangement of the story to create tension. A plot might begin with the king weeping on his throne and then flash back to reveal that his son is missing. Milton chooses plot over story. He begins his story at a point of absolute catastrophe. The war is over, the rebellion has failed. The angels are already burning. By starting here, he grips us immediately with the tragedy of the situation rather than giving us a slow history lesson on creation. Since the poem starts in the middle, we must pause to understand the events that happened before page 1. If you are unfamiliar with the biblical narrative, let me weave the synopsis for you. In the beginning, according to this lore, God was the be-all and end-all, the solitary source of all creation. He created the angels, beings of pure light. Among them, one shone brighter than all others, Lucifer, the bearer of light. Lucifer was the closest to God, the most significant of his creations. But the harmony of heaven was shattered by a political appointment. God announced that his son, who would later be known as Christ, was to be his vice-regent, the successor to his power. Lucifer was stunned. He had served God faithfully. He was a brighter star. Why was he passed over? His pride was wounded, and he gathered a lobby of dissatisfied angels, a third of heaven's population, and raised the flag of rebellion. They thought they could match God's power, but they had miscalculated. They did not know about God's ultimate weapon, the thunder. God unleashed this cosmic force, pinning the rebel angels down and casting them out of the gates of heaven. They fell for 9 days and nights into the deep, burning tract of hell, a prison God had prepared in advance. Now, with heaven emptied of a third of its population, God turned his creativity elsewhere. He decided to create a new race, perhaps to replace the fallen angels. He created Adam from the dust and placed him in the Garden of Eden. But Adam was lonely, and so, from Adam's rib, or perhaps his side, God fashioned Eve. They lived in paradise with only one condition, one solitary rule to prove their obedience. You may eat of any tree, but you must not touch the fruit of the tree of knowledge. Now, a small correction for your general knowledge, we often visualize this fruit as an apple. However, the Bible never specified it as such. We call it an apple of convenience, but in the text, it is simply the forbidden fruit, a unique, mysterious test of loyalty. Now, while Adam and Eve lived in innocence, Satan, the new name for the fallen Lucifer, was plotting in hell. He knew he could not defeat God with force, so he chose to destroy what God loved. He infiltrated Eden and targeted Eve. He seduced her mind with arguments. Why is knowledge forbidden? If you eat, you will not die. You will become gods. Eve fell. She ate the fruit, and in that moment, the innocence of the world shattered. She offered it to Adam, and he, faced with the choice of obeying God or staying with his wife, chose his wife. He chose suffering. They ate, and immediately the shame of nakedness descended upon them. They covered themselves with leaves. When God discovered their sin, the punishment was swift. They were banished from paradise. Man was cursed to toil and sweat for his food. Woman was cursed to suffer pain in childbirth. And the serpent was cursed to crawl upon its belly forever. This is the story Milton wants to tell, the fall of man. Yet, strangely, Book 1 does not begin with man. It begins with the villain. This has led critics to ask for centuries, is Milton on the devil's side? Why is the antagonist the first face we see? We will answer that in time. For now, let us look at the architecture of the first book itself, which unfolds in 5 distinct movements. The first movement happens between lines 1 to 83, which also contains the invocation. The book opens with a prayer. Milton calls upon the heavenly muse, not the pagan muses of Greece, but the Holy Spirit itself. He asks for illumination, admitting his own blindness, and states his grand purpose: to justify the ways of God to men. The second movement happens between lines 84 to 220, the dialogue in the fire. With a shift to the burning lake, we see Satan, huge and ruined, lying beside his second-in-command, Beelzebub. This is a scene of political recovery. They are in agony, but they are talking. They are arguing. They are trying to find a reason to keep existing. It is here that Satan realizes that while they have lost the battle of force, they can start a new war of guile and deceit. The third movement happens between lines 221 to 313, which is the resurrection of the wicked Satan. He manages to lift his massive frame from the liquid fire. He flies to the dry land of hell, which burns with solid fire, and calls out his army. This is the moment he transitions from a prisoner to a commander. The fourth movement happens between lines 314 to 570. This is the roll call. Milton gives us a catalogue of the demons. As they rise from the lake, we hear their names: Moloch, Chemosh, Baalim. These are not random names. These are the false gods that will later plague the human race in the Old Testament. Milton is ingeniously suggesting that the pagan gods of history were actually these fallen angels in disguise. The fifth and final moment in this book happens between lines 571 to 798, which is the building of the pandemonium. The book finally concludes with a spectacle. The demons do not just sit in the dirt, they build. They mine the floor of hell for gold and construct a palace that rivals the beauty of heaven. They call it Pandemonium, the capital of hell. It is here, amidst this terrifying golden splendor, that they gather for their great council to decide the fate of man. Now, in the previous sections, we walked through the ruins of the English Civil War and stood beside the blind poet as he faced the wreckage of his political dreams. Now, we step across the threshold of the poem itself. We are about to look at the first 26 lines of Paradise Lost, a section known as the invocation. To understand these lines, we must first understand the tradition Milton was stepping into. For centuries, epic poets like Homer and Virgil began their monumental works with a prayer. They recognized that the stories were about the stories of the Trojan War, the founding of Rome, or the anger of Achilles were too heavy for a mere mortal to carry alone. They needed divine help. So they would call upon a muse, a goddess of inspiration, to breathe life into their words. This act is called an invocation. It is a humble admission that the poet is merely a vessel for a higher power. But John Milton was not a pagan Greek or Roman. He was a devout, radical Christian. He could not, in good conscience, pray to a myth. He needed a muse that was real, one that predated the gods of Olympus. And so, in these opening lines, Milton takes this ancient convention and baptizes it, transforming a pagan ritual into a deeply personal Christian prayer. Milton begins his epic with a sentence that is architectural in its construction. It is a massive suspended structure that forces the reader to hold their breath. In normal English speech, we usually place the subject and the verb at the beginning of a sentence. We might say, "Sing, heavenly muse, about man's first disobedience." But Milton reverses this order entirely. He stacks clause upon clause, like of man's first disobedience, and the fruit of that forbidden tree, whose mortal taste brought death onto the world, building a tower of tragedy and consequence before he finally arrives at the verb, sing. By structuring the sentence this way, Milton forces us to look at the entire scope of human history before the poem even properly begins. In these first few lines, he compresses the entire plot of the Bible. He moves from the act of eating the fruit to the consequence of death and the loss of Eden, and finally to the resolution, the coming of the greater man, Jesus Christ, who will restore humanity. It is a sweeping vision of time, stretching from the first sin in the garden to the final redemption, all contained within the first breath of the poem. Now, when Milton finally addresses his inspiration, he calls it the heavenly muse. But he is careful to identify exactly who this spirit is. He transports us from the literary world of Greece to the sacred landscapes of the Bible. He speaks of a spirit that inspired that shepherd who first taught the chosen seed. Here, Milton is weaving a specific biblical narrative into his poem. The shepherd he refers to is Moses, the man who led the Israelites out of Egypt. Imagine the scene Milton is evoking. Moses standing alone on the secret summit of Mount Oreb or Sinai. The earth trembling, the clouds descending, speaking face to face with God. It was there that Moses received the inspiration to write the book of Genesis. By invoking the same spirit that spoke to Moses, Milton is making a staggering claim about his own work. He is suggesting that Paradise Lost is not merely a work of fiction or imagination. He is claiming for himself the authority of a prophet. He believes he is standing in the same lineage as Moses, preparing to reveal truths that have been hidden since the beginning of time. As the invocation continues, we hear the voice of the Renaissance scholar, the man who read every book in Europe. Milton declares that his song will pursue things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme. This is the voice of supreme confidence. He is looking back at the great poets of antiquity, Homer, Virgil, Dante, and telling them that he intends to fly higher. He uses the metaphor of the Aeonian Mount or Mount Helicon, which is the home of the classical muses. Milton asserts that his poem will soar above this mountain. Why? Because his subject matter is higher. Homer sang of the anger of men. Milton sings of the mercy of God. He is charting a course through the air that no poet has ever dared to fly, driven by an ambition to write the definitive Christian epic. But then the tone of the poem shifts dramatically. The confident scholar vanishes and the humble Puritan appears. Milton moves his focus from the high mountains of Sinai and Helicon to the intimate scene of the human heart. He addresses the Holy Spirit directly, acknowledging that this Spirit prefers before all temples the upright heart and pure. This is a crucial moment for understanding Milton's theology. As a Puritan, he believed that God did not reside in the stone cathedrals of the Catholics or the Anglicans, nor in their rituals and golden altars. He believed God resided in the faithful heart of the individual believer. He asks the Spirit, the same creative force, that dove-like satirist brooding on the vast abyss at the dawn of creation, to perform a new act of creation under his own mind. He asks the Spirit to hatch this poem just as it hatched the universe. It is here that the invocation becomes heartbreakingly personal. We must remember that the man writing these lines sits in total physical darkness. When Milton says, "What in me is dark, illumine," he's speaking on two levels. Metaphorically, he is asking for spiritual enlightenment, admitting that his human mind is too dark and ignorant to understand the mysteries of God. But literally, he is a blind man begging for an inner light to replace the sunlight he has lost. He asks to be raised and supported, acknowledging his weakness and frailty. It is a moment of profound vulnerability. The great revolutionary is on his knees, admitting that without divine help, he is powerless to tell the story. Finally, Milton arrives at the destination of his prayer. He states the ultimate purpose of Paradise Lost. He is not writing this poem for fame nor to entertain. He is writing to assert eternal providence and justify the ways of God to men. This is the thesis of this entire epic. Milton looks at the world around him, a world of suffering, death, and political defeat, and he sees a world that looks unfair. Why did God allow Adam to fall? Why does God allow evil to exist? Why did the righteous Republican collapse? Milton takes it upon himself to act as a cosmic defense attorney. He intends to put God on trial and prove to the jury, us, the readers, that God is just, that his providence, his foresight and care is eternal, and that the fault lies not with the Creator, but with the free will of the created. This is the stage Milton sets in the first 26 lines. He establishes his theme, identifies his divine inspiration, admits his own human weakness, and sets himself the impossible task of explaining the mind of God to the mind of men. With the prayer finished,
Now, in the
he
last
is now
section,
ready
we had
to
left
descend
John Milton at the
into the
height of his
depths
prayer,
of hell, standing in his physical darkness and begging the heavenly muse for inner light. Now the prayer is finished. The poet turns his blind eyes toward history and asks the first crucial question of the epic. How did this tragedy begin? Milton asks the muse to say first, because heaven hides nothing from her view. What caused our grandparents, Adam and Eve, to fall from their happy state in Eden? Remember, in Milton's vision, Adam and Eve were favored by God. They had everything. What could possibly make them transgress this one solitary restraint God placed upon them? The muse answers with a single terrifying name, the infernal serpent. This is our first introduction to Satan in this poem, and it is vital that you notice how Milton paints him. He does not introduce him as a glorious warrior or a misunderstood hero. He uses specific loaded words. He calls him infernal, a word borrowed from Dante and classical mythology meaning hellish. He speaks of his guile, a word that implies cunning, deceit, and a lack of honor. Most importantly, he says that Satan seduced the mother of mankind. Seduction is not a weapon of war, it is a weapon of treachery. It implies twisting the truth to make evil look attractive. Right from the start, Milton is warning us, do not be tricked by Satan's rhetoric. He may sound magnificent, but he is a liar. Milton then flashes back to the moment Satan fell, giving us the backstory of the villain. We learn that it was pride that cast him out of heaven. He is the driving force of ambition, the desire to set himself in glory above his fears and to equal the Most High. His ambition led him to raise an impious war in heaven, a war that Milton describes as vain. He uses the word vain with a double meaning. It was vain because it was full of false pride, but it was also vain because it was utterly fruitless. He cannot defeat the Almighty. The description of the fall is violent and cinematic. The almighty power hurled Satan headlong, flaming from the ethereal sky. You must imagine a comet crashing down, burning with hideous ruin and combustion, as it plummets into the bottomless pit. Here, Milton bends the laws of physics to show us the scale of this event. He says Satan and his rebel angels fell for 9 times the space that measures day and night to mortal men. It is a strange and beautiful phrase. Milton is writing long before the age of relativity. Yet, he intuitively links time and space using space to measure time. 9 days and nights is a long time to fall. It emphasizes the sheer, terrifying distance between the grace of heaven and the depth of hell. When Satan finally crashes, he finds himself in a dungeon horrible. This is not the cartoon hell of red devils and pitchforks that we see in popular culture. This is a psychological and physical nightmare. Milton describes it as a fiery deluge, fed with ever burning sulfur unconsumed. But the most famous description the one you will likely quote in your exams, concerns the light. Milton writes that from these flames there was no light, but rather darkness visible. The phrase darkness visible is a famous oxymoron. How can darkness be seen? How can fire not produce light? Milton is doing something profound here. On a scientific level, we know that some flames, like burning sulfur, give off heat without much illumination. But on a theological level, Milton is saying something else. Light represents God and hope. Hell is the absolute absence of God. Therefore, it must be dark. The fire in hell provides the heat of torture, but it refuses to provide the comfort of light. It is a dim, gloomy glow that serves only to reveal sights of woe. Milton piles on the despair. In this place, peace and rest can never dwell, and most chillingly, hope never comes that comes to all. Even in the worst human prison, a prisoner can hope for release or death. In hell, there is no death to escape to. The angels are immortal, which means their torture is without end. Milton then zooms out to show us exactly where this prison is located in this cosmos. He describes it as being as far removed from God and light of heaven as from the center thrice to the utmost pole. Imagine the entire universe as a sphere with Earth, the sun, and the stars inside. The distance from the center of that sphere to its outer shell is massive. Milton tells us that hell is 3 times that distance further down into chaos. It is a place of absolute exile. Finally, we return to the figure of Satan. He's chained on the burning lake, unable to move his massive limbs. He turns his baleful eyes full of pain and hate, and sees he is not alone. Lying next to him is the angel who was next himself in power and next in crime. It is Beelzebub. But Milton pauses to tell us that Beelzebub was not his name in heaven. In heaven, he had a glorious name, brighter than a star, but the name has been erased forever from the book of life. He is now known only by the name that the enemies of Israel gave him later in history, Baal-zebub, the Lord of the Flies. Satan looks at his old friend and is shocked by transformation, exclaiming, "Oh, how unlike the place from whence they fell." This sets the stage for the first real action of the poem. Satan, though ruined and in agony, is about to break the horrid silence and speak. Now that the silence is shattered, we have reached the moment in Book 1 where the protagonist of the poem, or perhaps the antagonist, depending on your perspective, speaks his first words. This section, running from lines 84 to 241, is not merely a dialogue between two ruined spirits. It is a masterclass in political rhetoric, a study in self-delusion, and a geographical tour of a world made of fire. As the narrative focus shifts from the general scene of hell to the specific figure of Satan, we find him chained on the burning lake, turning his head to find his second in command, Beelzebub. His opening words are heavy with shock. He exclaims, "If thou beest he, but oh, how fallen, how changed." immediately drawing our attention to the physical transformation that sin has wrought. Satan does not mourn the loss of God's love or the loss of moral purity. He mourns the loss of transcendent brightness. From his very first breath, Milton establishes Satan as a creature obsessed with appearances. He remembers Beelzebub not for his virtue, but for how bright he used to shine in the happy realms of light. This obsession with the external, with the glamour of power rather than the substance of it, becomes the defining trait of his character throughout the epic. But as Satan continues to speak, we see the mind of the politician at work. He refuses to admit that he lost the war because he was wrong, or because his opponent was omnipotent. Instead, he spins a narrative of excuse. He argues that they were defeated only by a technicality, the thunder. He asks, till then, who knew the force of those dire arms? Implying that God won not by right, but by a superior weapon that the rebels were unaware of. He goes even further, describing the war in heaven as a dubious battle, suggesting that the outcome was uncertain, like a coin toss that simply went the wrong way. This is the logic of the loser who cannot face the reality of absolute defeat. He convinces himself that with better intelligence and better preparation, the result might have been different. It is in this context of denial that Satan delivers the lines that have echoed through centuries of literature, becoming a manifesto for rebels everywhere. What though the field be lost? All is not lost. He lists his remaining assets: the unconquerable will, the study of revenge, and immortal hate. It sounds magnificent. It sounds like the defiance of a Renaissance hero refusing to bow down to a tyrant. But we must be careful not to be seduced by the poetry. Milton laces this heroism with poison. When Satan declares that courage never to submit or yield is his glory, he is actually defining his existence by immortal hate. He frames the act of repentance, suing for grace, as a humiliation, low indeed, whereas in the Christian moral framework, repentance is the highest form of strength. Milton presents us with a hero who would rather be eternally hateful than momentarily humble. Beelzebub, however, is not so easily swept away by this rhetoric. In his reply, he acts as the voice of grim reality. He acknowledges God as a conqueror and raises the terrifying possibility that their survival is not a blessing but a curse. He asks, what use it is to have strength undiminished or eternal being if it only serves to undergo eternal punishment? Beelzebub fears that they have been left alive only to serve as thralls in the heart of hell, doing God's errands in the fire. He strips away Satan's glamour and exposes the true horror of their situation. They are immortal prisoners who can never die to escape their pain. Satan immediately realizes he must shut down this line of thinking. He cannot allow his lieutenant to despair, for despair leads to submission. He counters with a new doctrine, a strategic pivot that defines the nature of evil for the rest of the poem. He declares, to do aught good never will be our task, but ever to do ill our sole delight. He establishes a binary opposition. If God seeks to bring good out of evil, their job is to pervert that end. This is the moment Satan realizes that since he lacks the power to create, he must dedicate his existence to destruction. He accepts that his identity is now purely reactionary. He is the shadow that seeks only to dim the light. Satan then notices that the sulphurous hail of the storm has paused, and he suggests they move from the liquid fire of the lake to the dreary plain of solid fire nearby. As Satan moves to lift his massive frame from the lake, Milton pauses the action to give us an epic simile, an extended comparison that serves to emphasize the sheer scale of the arc fiend. Milton compares Satan to the titans of Greek mythology who warned on Jove, but more famously, he compares him to the Leviathan, the massive sea beast of the Bible. Milton paints a vivid picture of a Norwegian pilot in a small skiff who mistakes the sleeping whale for an island. The pilot anchors his boat in the scaly rind of the beast, thinking he is safe, while he waits for morning. This image does two things. First, it gives us a sense of Satan's physical immensity. He is an island unto himself. But second, and more importantly, it serves as a warning. Just as the sailor is deceived by the whale, mistaking a living monster for solid ground, anyone who puts their trust in Satan is anchoring themselves to destruction. The Leviathan will eventually dive, and the sailor will drown. Milton is telling us that Satan's stability is an illusion. He is a trap waiting to spring. Crucially, Milton interrupts this description to correct a theological point. As Satan rears his head and flies toward the land, the poet reminds us that he does not move by his own power. He tells us that Satan would never have heaved his head were it not for the will and hypermission of all-ruling heaven. God allows Satan to escape the lake. He gives him a long leash, not out of negligence, but so that Satan, through his reiterated crimes, can heap more damnation upon himself. It is a terrifying thought. Satan thinks he is rebelling, but even his rebellion is permitted by God to serve a greater justice. Finally, the two fallen angels land on the burning mark. The ground is solid fire, described with the intensity of a volcano's singed bottom, referencing Mount Etna. Yet, standing on this burning soil, Satan attempts to reclaim his dignity. He looks out at the mournful gloom and delivers a salutation that is both tragic and absurd. He says, "Hail, horrors! Hail, infernal world, and thou profoundest hell! Receive thy new possessor." He acts like a conquering king, claiming a new territory, ignoring the reality that he is merely a prisoner claiming his own cell. He tries to assert ownership over his punishment, a final, desperate attempt to turn his ruin into a kingdom. They are already building a fortress of lies to protect their wounded egos. But as Satan stands on this burning soil, the reality of the situation hits him. He looks around at the desolate landscape, the mournful gloom, and contrasts it with the celestial light of the heaven he has lost. It is a moment of profound heartbreak, though he tries to hide it. He asks, "Is this the region, this the soil, the clime, that we must change for heaven?" For a fleeting second, the mask slips and we see the sorrow of the exile. However, Satan is a politician, and a politician can never show weakness. He immediately stiffens his resolve. He declares, "Be it so." This phrase is a strategy of the defeated. When you have lost a war, the only way to maintain your dignity is to pretend that you don't care. If you cry, the victor wins twice. If you shrug and say, "I'm fine," you deny the victor his satisfaction. Satan justifies this by framing God not as a loving creator, but as a tyrant. He refers to God as he who now is sovereign, implying that God rules only by the strength of arms, not by justice. He argues that since God is irrational and autocratic, farthest from him is best. He tries to convince Beelzebub and himself that exile is not a punishment, but a liberation. He bids farewell happy fields, where joy forever dwells, and turns to face his new reality with a chilling salutation. Hail horrors, hail infernal world, and thou profoundest hell. Receive thy new possessor. Notice the word possessor. Satan is obsessed with ownership. In the Christian ethos, a true believer owns nothing. Everything belongs to God. But Satan wants property. He marks his territory, he claims hell as his own kingdom, trying to turn a prison into a palace simply by asserting ownership over it. Now we arrive at the most famous line in the epic. Lines that have seduced readers for centuries. Satan declares, "The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell and a hell of heaven." On the surface, this sounds magnificent. It is the ultimate expression of Renaissance humanism and Stoicism. The idea that the human will is stronger than any external circumstance. It sounds inspiring. If you were to say this to a person living in poverty or despair, it would be a message of hope. Your environment does not define you. Your mind does. But you must be careful. Milton is handing Satan the most beautiful lines in the poem, but he is placing them in the mouth of the father of lies. When Satan says he has a mind not to be changed by place or time, he presents this fixity as a strength. But is it? To be unable to change? To be unable to learn from your mistakes? To be unable to adapt or repent? This is not strength. This is a handicap. It is a spiritual paralysis. Furthermore, is Satan actually free? He says he can make a heaven of hell. But we must remember that when he is in heaven, he was miserable. He carried his envy and ambition, his inner hell, into the very heart of paradise. Later in the poem, in Book 4, Satan will admit, "Which way I fly is hell. Myself am hell." The mind is indeed its own place, but for Satan, that place is a cage. He is not the king of hell. He is a prisoner trapped inside his own unchangeable hatred. Satan continues his speech with a line that resonates deeply with the modern spirit. "Here at least we shall be free. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven." This is the ultimate anti-establishment slogan. It appeals to our post-colonial instincts. Think of the history of nations like India fighting for independence in 1947. The sentiment was that it is better to rule one's own poor country, devastated country, than to be a wealthy servant of a colonial empire. Satan taps into this desire for autonomy. He argues that God has not built hell to be a place of envy. God won't come here to take it back. Therefore, they are secure. But again, look at the reality. Satan calls himself free, yet he is acting exactly as God intended. He claims to reign, but he reigns over a pit of fire and ash. He is a king of nothing. He frames his expulsion as a choice. In my choice, to reign is worth ambition, pretending that he chose to leave rather than being thrown out headlong by the thunder. It is a masterclass in spinning a narrative. He is convincing his followers that they are the pioneers of a new world rather than the debris of an old one. The speech ends with a shift in focus. Satan remembers his troops. He asks, "But wherefore let we, then our faithful friends, lie thus astonished on the oblivious pool?" He realizes that he cannot build this kingdom alone. He needs his army. He needs to wake them from their stupor and give them a purpose. He proposes a plan. They will try to see what may be yet regained in heaven or what more lost in hell. Notice the uncertainty. He offers them a gamble, a purpose. And in place of external torture, having a purpose, even a doomed one, is the only thing that makes existence bearable. Beelzebub answers him in lines 271 to 83. He plays the role of the loyal hype man. He addresses Satan as a leader of those armies bright, feeding Satan's ego. He tells Satan that if the fallen angels hear his voice, the voice that was their liveliest pledge of hope during the war, they will revive. Beelzebub knows the truth. The army is groveling and prostrate on the lake, utterly defeated. But he also knows that Satan's rhetoric is their only drug. He urges Satan to speak, knowing that his voice is the signal that will turn a mob of refugees into an organized army of darkness. As we close this section, we must step back and look at the man writing these lines. When Milton wrote, "The mind is its own place," he was blind, politically hated, and living in a world that had rejected everything he stood for. In a way, Milton was living in hell. It is possible that these lines are the most autobiographical in the entire poem. Milton, like Satan, had to convince himself that his mind could not create a heaven out of his dark, lonely circumstances. He had to believe that his inner light was brighter than the sun he could no longer see. So when you read these lines, do not simply admire Satan. Recognize him as a liar who is trapping himself in his own ego. But admire Milton, the poetic genius who could sit in this darkness and forge words of such blindfolding power that they convinced the world that the devil was a hero, even while showing us exactly how he damned himself. Now that we have witnessed the terrifying awakening of Satan on the burning lake and his defiant landing on the solid fire of hell, the narrative scope widens. We move from the singular figure of the archfiend to the awakening of his legions. This section, spanning roughly from lines 283 to 521, is often referred to as the roll call. But to treat it merely as a list is to miss the point. This is Milton's grand historical argument. He is about to explain the origin of every pagan religion that has ever challenged the Judeo-Christian God. As Satan stands on the shore, preparing to summon his troops, Milton first draws our attention to the sheer scale of the figure before us. He describes Satan's shield, which hangs on his shoulder like a massive, round object of ethereal temper. To convey its size, Milton compares it to the moon, but not just the romantic moon of poetry. He specifically invokes the moon as viewed through the optic glass of the Tuscan artist Galileo. By placing Satan's shield under the telescope of modern science, Milton suggests that this glory, like the moon, is spotty, scarred, and imperfect. Next, he describes Satan's spear. He asks us to imagine the tallest pine hewn on the Norwegian hills to serve as the mast of a great flagship. Yet, compared to the spear of the archfiend, this massive timber is but a wand, a mere twig. Through these physical descriptions, Milton establishes a sense of awe that is both magnificent and terrifying. Satan looks out upon the lake where his millions of followers lie entranced and paralyzed. Here, Milton deploys one of the most haunting epic similes in the English language. He compares the scarred bodies of the angels scattered to autumnal leaves that strew the brooks in Vallombrosa. The image is rich with melancholy, autumnal, suggesting decay, the end of a cycle and the loss of life. Just as dead leaves choke the flow of a stream, these ruined spirits choke the burning lake. Milton then layers a second historical image over this one, comparing them to the scattered sedge of the Red Sea, explicitly referencing the destruction of the Pharaoh's army that pursued Moses. By linking the fallen angels to the enemies of Israel, Milton marks them as the eternal antagonists of God's chosen people. When Satan finally breaks the silence and calls to them, shaming them for resting while Conqueror watches, the effect is immediate. The legions rise like a cloud of locusts. They are ashamed, yet obedient to their general's voice. As they assemble on the plain, Milton begins the roll call. This is his great conceit. He argues that these fallen angels did not stay in hell. Instead, they eventually escaped to earth and tricked early humanity into worshipping them as gods. Therefore, the deities of the ancient world, Moloch, Chemosh, Osiris, Baal, are not imaginary beings. They are these very demons in disguise. First among them marches Moloch, the horrid king. He is the embodiment of pure violence and hate. Milton describes him as a besmeared with blood of human sacrifice and parents' tears. Moloch is the god who demands the ultimate price, the lives of children. Milton chillingly describes the noise of drums and timbrels used to drown out the screams of infants passing through the fire to his grim idol. We are told he corrupted the wise king Solomon himself, leading him to build a temple for Moloch right against the temple of God on the Mount of Olives, turning the pleasant valley of Hinnom into a place of death, which later became known as Gehenna, a type of hell on earth. Next comes Chemosh, the obscene dread of the Moabites. While Moloch represents hate, Chemosh represents lust. Milton tells us that he extended his empire of lustful orgies to the very same hill of Skandar, where Moloch stood. It is a profound psychological observation. Milton places lust, Chemosh, and hate, Moloch, side by side, suggesting that these two passions are the twin destroyers of the human soul. Following them come the collective spirits known as Balium and Ashtaroth. Here, Milton touches upon the fluid nature of these spirits. He writes, "For spirits, when they please, can either sex assume, or both." To the modern reader, this gender fluidity might seem fascinating, but to the strict Puritan mind of Milton, it is an abomination. He views this lack of fixed identity as unnatural, a rejection of God's order. He dismisses these spirits who lead the Israelites to forsake the righteous altar as agents of confusion and chaos. Then we meet Astoreth, whom the Phoenicians called Astarte, the queen of heaven. She is the moon goddess, portrayed with crescent horns. Her worship involves Sidonian virgins, singing vows on moonlit nights. This imagery is aesthetically beautiful. Soft light, singing, the mystery of the night. Yet, Milton's judgment is harsh. He calls her an offensive goddess and her image foul. This is a critical moment where we must pause and question Milton. His Puritanism allows no room for the beauty of nature worship or the divine feminine. It is not of his God, he labels it demonic. When then we see Thamus, whose anal would cause the river Adonis to run purple to the sea, Milton dismisses the amorous deities of the women who mourn him, seeing it as a seductive myth that distracts them from the truth. Following him is Dagon, the sea monster, half man and half fish, who famously fell flat before the Ark of the Covenant in the Bible, shaming his worshippers by shattering his own idol. Milton also swiftly dismisses the Egyptian pantheon, Osiris, Isis, Horus, as monstrous shapes and bleating herds, revealing a deep cultural intolerance for the animal-headed deities of Africa. Finally, the procession ends with Belial. He is perhaps the most dangerous of them all. Milton tells us, to him no temple stood, yet he is worshipped everywhere. Belial is the spirit of vice for itself. He represents lewdness, sloth, and smooth-talking corruption. He reigns in courts and palaces, and in luxurious cities. When night darkness the street, the sons of Belial wander forth, insolent with wine. Through Belial, Milton is launching a scathing political critique of his own time. He views the Restoration Court of King Charles II, with its theatres, drinking, and loose morals, as the kingdom of Belial. Belial is the demon of the civilized world, the vice that hides behind a silk suit and a charming smile. As this terrifying parade concludes, we are left with a complex picture. On one hand, Milton has brilliantly woven all of human religious history into his Christian epic, giving a theological explanation for the existence of pagan gods. On the other hand, we see the limitations of his worldview. His dismissal of the Middle Eastern, African, and feminine divine traditions as merely foul or monstrous reflects the rigid intolerance of his age. Yet, as readers, we witness the sheer power of his poetry, which transforms these dry names from the Old Testament into a living, breathing army of darkness, ready to wage war on heaven once again. Now, as Satan finishes his initial address, the time for rhetoric ends and the time for display begins. The imperial ensign, the great flag of hell, is raised by Azazel, a mighty cherub. This is a moment of pure spectacle. The banner shines like a meteor streaming across the dark wind, emblazoned with gold and rich gems. At the sight of their colors, the millions of fallen angels let out a shout, their tears through the hollow deep of hell. A sound so loud and defiant that, had it been on earth, it would have silenced the greatest armies of history. Here, Milton pauses to give us a sense of scale through a magnificent epic simile. He looks at all the great armies of human legend and history, the heroes of the Trojan War, the knights of King Arthur, the crusaders of the Saracens who fought for the Holy Land. He gathers all these mighty human warriors in his mind and dismisses them. Compared to Satan's army, he says, these human forces are no bigger than pygmies fighting cranes. The fallen angels are giants, not just in size, but in power. Satan reviews his troops. He sees them standing in perfect military order, breathing as one force. His heart swells with pride, but as he looks closer, that pride turns to grief. He sees their faces, once shining with the light of heaven, now scarred by the thunder of God. Milton compares them to a forest of oak or pine trees that have been struck by lightning on a heath, standing tall, but with their tops withered and their glory signed. Yet, despite their ruin, they bow to him. This loyalty breaks Satan. For a moment, the villain falls away, and we see a tragic leader. He tries to speak, but 3 times he fails. 3 times. Tears such as angels weep, burst forth. Finally, with great effort, he suppresses the emotion and begins his address. His speech is a masterclass in deception. He refuses to accept blame. Instead, he blames God, claiming that the Almighty concealed his strength merely to tempt them into rebellion. He portrays himself as a victim of entrapment. He admits that they cannot defeat God in open war again. So he proposes a new strategy, guile. If they cannot force God out of heaven, they will grieve him by corrupting his new creation. He speaks of a rumor, a prophecy about a new world and a new creature called man. Peace is despaired, he declares. War then, war, open or understood, must be resolved. At the word war, millions of flaming swords are drawn, flashing in the darkness, clashing against shields with a din that shakes the very foundations of hell. But an army needs a capital. The narrative now shifts from war to industry. A group of angels, led by Mammon, marches towards a hill that shines with a metallic glow. Milton introduces Mammon as a spirit of greed, noting that even when he was in heaven, he was the least erected spirit, always walking with his head down to admire the golden pavement of heaven rather than looking up at God. Under Mammon's direction, the demons wound the burning earth. They dig into the bowels of hell and find gold. Milton writes with biting cynicism here, nothing that we shouldn't be surprised that gold grows in hell, for that soil deserves such a precious bane. Then comes the architect, Mulciber. In heaven, he was a great builder who constructed the crystal towers of the angels. Milton recounts a famous Greek myth where Mulciber, or Hephaestus, was thrown off Mount Olympus by an angry Jupiter, falling from morning until noon, and noon until dewy eve, like a falling star. But Milton quickly corrects the myth. Mulciber fell long before that, with Satan. Now he uses his skills for the infernal empire. Suddenly, to the sound of dulcet symphonies and voices sweet, a massive structure rises from the earth like exhalation, like a mist rising from a swamp. It is effortless and magical. This is Pandemonium, the high capital of Satan. It is built in the classical style with Doric pillars, golden archives, and bronze gates. Milton compares it to the great temples of Babylon and Egypt, suggesting that the grandest monuments of human paganism were merely cheap imitations of his demonic palace. However, a logistical problem remains. How can millions of giant angels fit into one building for council? Milton solves this with a shift in perspective. As the signal is given, the vast army begins to shrink. Milton uses two beautiful, delicate similes to describe this transformation. He compares them to bees in springtime, swarming around a hive and settling on flowers. He compares them to fairy elves that a peasant might see dancing in the forest at twilight. It is a strange magical ending to the book. The terrifying giants shrink down to the size of pygmies or dwarfs to fill the floor of the hall. But there is a political distinction. The great seraphic lords, the generals like Satan, Moloch, and Beelzebub, retain their own giant dimensions. They sit on their golden thrones, towering over the common angels. The book closes with a scene of ominous order. The doors of Pandemonium are shut. The silence falls. The 1,000 demigods sit waiting. The great consult is about to begin. The stage is set for the debate that will decide the fate of mankind. Now, as we step away from the fire and the demons to look at the blueprints of the poem itself, we are going to answer a fundamental question. Why does Paradise Lost feel so massive? Why does it sound like a cathedral made with words? The answer lies in the genre Milton chose, the epic. To understand Milton, you must understand that he was an architect working with ancient materials. An epic is not just a long poem. It is a monument. It is a grand narrative written in a dignified style, dealing with themes that define a nation or a race. But Milton wasn't content to just build another Iliad or Aeneid. He wanted to build something new. He took the primary epics of Homer, which were born from oral history and spontaneity, and the secondary epics of Virgil, which were conscious works of art, and he transformed them. He took the pagan armor of the classical world and melted it down to forge a Christian sword. Now the theme, it changed from national to universal. In the ancient world, epics were about nations. The Iliad was the story of Greece. The Aeneid was a propaganda of Rome. But Milton's ambition was far greater. He didn't want to write the history of England. He wanted to write the history of the universe. His theme, man's first disobedience, is not limited to one country or one time. It is universal. It touches every human being who has ever lived. And unlike Homer, who relied on myths, Milton believed he was writing the absolute truth. For him, the Bible was the ultimate reality, far beyond scientific investigation. He wasn't just telling a story, he was explaining the cosmos. What is the problem of the hero? Now, every epic needs a hero, a warrior like Achilles or a wanderer like Odysseus. But here, Milton is faced with a problem. Who is the hero of Paradise Lost? In Book 1, it certainly looks like Satan. He has the best speeches, the unconquerable will, and the defiant energy of a Greek warrior fighting a tyrant. He looks like a hero. But this is Milton's trap. He creates a character who acts like a classical hero to show us that the old definition of heroism, pride, war, and revenge, is actually demonic. Milton proposes a new kind of heroism. The true hero of the poem is arguably Adam, or perhaps the Son of God. But Adam isn't a warrior, he's a learner. He doesn't win by killing enemies, he wins by repenting. Milton redefines heroism from doing great deeds to suffering with patience. He replaces the sword with the soul. Now, to build this massive structure, Milton used specific tools or conventions that every epic poet uses. But he used them in his own way. First, into the middle of things, or in medias res. Milton doesn't start at the beginning. If he followed the timeline, he would start with God creating the angels. Instead, he drops us right into the aftermath of the disaster. In medias res. We start with Satan already in hell, defeated and confused. This creates immediate tension and mystery, forcing us to ask, how did we get here? We only learn the backstory later, just as Adam does. 2. The heavenly muse, or the invocation. Homer prayed to the muses of Mount Helicon. Milton prays too, but he turns his back on the Greek goddesses. He invokes the heavenly muse, the Holy Spirit itself. He claims that his muse is far better because it inspired Moses on Mount Sinai. He boldly declares that he intends to soar above the Ionian Mount, above classical literature, because his subject is truth, not fiction. 3. The epic simile. Milton loved to pause the action to paint a picture. These are known as epic similes, but his comparisons are never simple. When he compares Satan's shield to the moon, he adds a layer of science by referencing Galileo's telescope. He shows us that Satan's glory, like the moon, is spotty and imperfect. When he compares the fallen angels to autumn leaves, he isn't just describing their number, he is evoking death, decay, and the choking of life. Every simile is a mini poem that adds depth to the main story. 4. The roll call. Just as Homer listened the ships sailing to Troy, Milton listed the armies of hell. But he gives this list a terrifying twist. He reveals that these fallen angels, Moloch, Chemosh, Belial, are not just random demons. They are the future pagan gods of the ancient world. He ingeniously connects his Christian epic with all of human history, arguing that the gods worshipped by the ancients were actually devils in disguise. The sound of the epic. Finally, there is a grand style. Milton created a new dialect of English to suit his subject. He knew that everyday speech wasn't enough for God and Satan. So he twisted English syntax using long Latin-style sentences that force you to hold complex thoughts in your head. He filled his lines with archaic words and biblical thunder. And most importantly, he wrote in blank verse, unrhymed iambic pentameter. He rejected rhyme as a form of bondage, showing instead the liberty of a rhyme that rolls on like the ocean. And what is the point of all of this? To justify the ways of God to men? But Milton was too great a poet to write a simple sermon. He created a villain so compelling, so full of injured merit, that he complicated his own moral. He allowed Satan to be dramatic, to be persuasive, to almost hijack the poem. This moral ambiguity is what makes Paradise Lost not just a religious text, but a profound human drama. So when you read this poem, remember, you're looking at a building made of ancient stones, but designed by a radical new architect. Milton took the epic form and broke it open to fit the Christian soul. Stay tuned for more texts of discussion for both students and lovers of literature. Come get acquainted through the magic of literature.